prayer and then get started. Dear Lord, I thank you for the blessings you give us. I thank you for the opportunities to come together and worship and to study your word. I pray that this message will be edifying and used for your glory. So I pray, amen. Okay, so we good to go? So last time we covered David's affair with Bathsheba and the loss of their child. Today we're going to cover what I'm going to call a son lost, a son found. And this will be 2 Samuel 12:15 to 14:24. This seems like a good place to have a section. And we'll back up a little bit and just kind of, because I think that this goes with more or less the message of this section. So we'll back up to 15. The Lord struck the baby that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the boy. He fasted, went home, and spent the night lying on the ground. The elders of his house stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he was unwilling and would not eat anything with them. On the seventh day, the baby died, but David's servants were afraid to tell him the baby was dead. They said, "Look, while the baby was alive, we spoke to him, and he wouldn't listen to us. So how can we tell him the baby is dead? He may do something desperate." When David saw that his servants were whispering to each other, he guessed that the baby was dead. So he asked his servants, "Is the baby dead?" "He is dead," they replied. Then David got up from the ground. He washed, anointed himself, changed his clothes, went to the Lord's house, and worshipped. Then he went home and requested something to eat. So they served him food, and he ate. His servants asked him, "What did you just do? While the baby was alive, you fasted and wept, but when he died, you got up and ate food." He answered, "While the baby was alive, I fasted and wept because I thought, 'Who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let me live.' But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I'll go to him, but he will never return to me." So this is going to establish a kind of pattern of behavior for David. We're going to see this almost exact same thing happen again. But something that I did for 1 Samuel was we talked about kind of the periods of Saul's life, and that you can more or less distinguish Saul's career into about 3 periods. You've got the early reign, which is fairly positive. Then you have the middle reign, where he's more or less in open disobedience. And then you have kind of the latter part of his reign, where he is not only disobedient, but openly going crazy. And I think that there's more or less markers for where these periods are. And I was actually thinking today, we can kind of break up David in a similar way. Although there's not really 3 periods, we're really going to see 4 periods for David's life. And when we talk about David and talk about, the things that David does, it really matters quite a bit what period of his life we're talking about. So, for example, there's the young period. There's young David. And this is the one we really love to talk about, although this is kind of marked from when we're first introduced to him, right, with the anointing of Samuel. And I would say it goes up to when he runs away to Moab. This David is young, he is reckless, he's impetuous. He can have moments of faith, but at the same time, he can also have lapses of faith. So he swings wildly back and forth. He is unpredictable. The word that comes to mind over and over again is he's just reckless. And young people can be reckless. But then we get kind of the next phase of his life, and this is after he's confronted with the prophet Gad, and this is in Moab, when he has what I like to call his Rafiki moment, for those who've watched The Lion King. Simba's in basically self-imposed exile, and then the prophet Rafiki shows up and with his little stick, and he bashes him on the head and says, kings don't get to go into exile, you got to go back. And so then Simba goes back to challenge Scar and become the rightful king. And that's basically what David does, right? Now that the prophet Gad has knocked some sense into him, he's going to go back and be the hero Israel needs. So from that moment forward, we see, I would argue, David at his most faithful and his most righteous. This is when he saves Keilah when he doesn't have to. This is when he spares Saul's life twice. This is when he protects Israel's southern border. Pretty much from the moment he returns from Moab up until, I would say, his anointing at Hebron, we have a fairly righteous David. Pretty much everything about him is positive. Then we have the royal phase. And that is basically from the moment he's anointed at Hebron through the initial civil war, through his acquiring Israel, through bringing the ark into Jerusalem, acquiring Jerusalem. I would say that this period of his life pretty much ends with the Bathsheba affair. That this is David who, so if we kind of are summarizing the periods, we've got the young David, which to me is just a very reckless David. We have the second phase where he's very noble. He's very, the word that comes to mind is just noble. He's actually kind of the hero he knows Israel needs him to be and that he can be. In the royal period, we see a very entitled David, a very arrogant David, a very proud David, a David who feels like, I deserve this, which culminates in basically when God finally does offer him the covenant. What should be the high point of David's life turns into kind of a dressing down. God doesn't seem very happy with David. He's like, who are you? You didn't earn this kingdom. I gave it to you. You didn't take it from Saul. I took it from Saul. And I could take it from you if I wanted to. And even when he says that he's going to make a covenant, he never actually, which is fascinating, he never actually says, I'm making a covenant with you. Even though we call it the Davidic covenant. He says, there is one who will come after you. I am making a covenant with him. And it seems like the blessings David's enjoying are because of this ancestor, whoever that ancestor may be. Again, almost like, putting David in his place. Like, this isn't about you. You're not as great as you think you are. So then, even though he has what should be a rather humbling moment, this leads to other moments. In the very next chapter, David gets very aggressive militarily. He starts conquering when he doesn't need to. He starts kind of beating the countries that he's already kind of pushed aside. He goes back and basically conquers them just to show he can do it. And this culminates in, again, him taking things that don't belong to him, which the worst example of this is a woman that doesn't belong to him, even though he feels like he can do whatever he wants. So then we get him being chastised by Nathan. So now we have another shift. And we are going to enter into the old phase David. And the word that just comes to mind is broken. This is a very different David. This is honestly a pathetic David. He's going to lose all of his confidence. He is going to become hesitant. He's not going to act when he needs to. He's going to be just kind of sulking around in Jerusalem most of the time because he doesn't even know what to do anymore. It seems like he's perhaps afraid that he's going to lose the blessing of Yahweh, even though Yahweh says he's not going to abandon him like he did Saul. David seems very cautious, very skeptical, very fearful, and it just keeps going downhill. So we're basically now entering into the final phase of David's life, which is not the most pleasant. With that in mind, a character who I feel like we can compare him to, but in a very contrasting way. There's another figure in the Bible that God goes out of his way to break, and that's Jacob. Jacob is very arrogant, he's very proud, he's very obnoxious, and God literally sends an angel to wrestle with him and break his hip, basically put him in his place. And we see, so two very broken men. We have Jacob and then we have David. But we see the directions they go from here in very different paths. Jacob actually becomes righteous. He actually becomes the servant of God he was always supposed to be, even though it's a very difficult path that he's going to walk. And whereas David is not going to go that path. He's not going to become the same righteous person he was when he was younger, which is unfortunate. So we're going to see, two very different paths. I love Jacob. I love the Jacob story. I'm not as big a fan of the David story because I just don't think it has the happy ending that Jacob's does. But with that said, we're going to continue. So in verse 24, then David comforted his wife Bathsheba. Remember, he married her after her husband conveniently passed away so that he could cover up the fact that she was pregnant. He went and slept with her, because that's what women need when they need comforting. She gave birth to a son and named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and he sent a message through Nathan the prophet, who named him Jedediah, because of the Lord. This is rather interesting because you may miss this, and even I missed it at first. So She names him Solomon, which is from Shalomo, which is peace, peaceful. But the prophet gives him the name Jedediah. And this name is actually built around the name David, which you may not notice. So the name David, you have the Hebrew, which I don't expect any of you to read, but Hebrew is a consonantal language. They don't actually have vowels. So the word David is actually the letters D, V, D, which I know is kind of funny, but that's the name. And then we have to supply the vowels depending on how we pronounce it. You can pronounce it slightly different ways, but David or Dawid is usually how it's said in Hebrew, and it means beloved, something like that. The name Jedediah, however, if you can see, we break it down. Actually, there's three components to this name. There's the yah at the beginning. Then there's the dyd, but this is a just kind of reshaping of the dvd. So when you see the double Ds, and this is the only time in church I can say that and not get laughed at. So when you see the two Ds, that's the name David. That's the word for beloved. So he has the double D in his name, like his dad. And then at the end, you have the YH, which is an abbreviation for Yahweh. So what's the Y at the beginning doing? Well, that's the pronoun for he. So he is the beloved of Yahweh, is what his name is. But you can actually see he's got his father's name within his name, which is odd because we don't really know him as Jedediah, even though you would think that would be a good kind of throne name. So in verse 26, Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and captured the royal fortress. Then Joab sent messengers to David to say, I have fought against Rabbah and have also captured the water supply. Now therefore assemble the rest of the troops, lay siege to the city and capture it, otherwise I will be the one to capture the city and it will be named after me. So Rabbah is one of the last remaining fortresses of the Ammonites. You can see here on the map, it's the red to the east. So just off the territory of Gad. We've already seen this problem with David, and apparently, as I've already said, the flaws are just going to become increasingly more pronounced. Why isn't David with the army? Why does he keep turning over everything to other people? People who probably shouldn't have this much power and influence. This is going to become an increasing problem. When you're a king and you keep allocating your authority, they're going to start challenging your authority, right? And this is going to be an issue with Joab and others who are going to try and take his authority from him. So Joab basically says, if you don't come and show up, you're not going to get any of the credit because you're at home in Jerusalem sulking, and you need to be out with your army. The kind of the initial thought that I had about this is, even though he's undergone some traumatic experience, right, with losing the child, life keeps going, right? The war doesn't stop because of this, right? The whole narrative around Bathsheba and Uriah is kind of sandwiched within this war with the Ammonites. So we got this episode within it. And even then, right, one of the complaints is, why is David at home anyway? Because he should have been with the army leading his forces against the Ammonites if it was that big of a deal. So in verse 29, so David assembled all the troops and went to Rabbah and fought against it and captured it. All I can think of is, you got some dad, and he's got some task, and he's done 99% of the work, but he wants his kid to feel like he's contributed. So he brings his kid over and goes, hey, why don't you just, knock this one last pin down or whatever so you can feel like you actually helped. Joab's already beaten the city. He's already beaten its submission. He just hasn't taken the credit for it yet. But he's going to let David come in and claim it because he knows if he doesn't, if he's not there for it, then the men are going to start losing respect for him. Start, losing. Yeah. So David does show up at the end to claim the credit that his generals have done, all the work that they've done. So in verse 30, he took the crown from the head of their king, and it was placed on David's head. The crown weighed 75 pounds of gold, and it had a precious stone in it. In addition, David took away a large quantity of plunder from the city. He removed the people who were in the city and put them to work with saws, iron picks, and iron axes, and to labor at brick-making. He did the same to all the Ammonite cities. Then he and all his troops returned to Jerusalem. So he's taken all the gold, taken all the plunder. He's basically enslaving the people that he's conquered. We've already seen this kind of before the Bathsheba incident, that he's kind of abusing, we talked about this, he's kind of abusing the covenant he made with Yahweh. Yahweh promised, I'm going to look out for you and ensure your prosperity, and so he's gone on the offensive, just taking over everything he can. And the only thing I can think of, and just what was just kind of going off in my head, is the story of King Midas. So there's the famous myth in Greek mythology of the king, and who was obsessed with gold, and so he prays to the gods, and he's like, if I can have one thing, I want to be able, so that I want it so that whatever I touch turns to gold. And the gods say, okay. And this is kind of one of the morals of Greek mythology, is that gods give you what you ask for, and it always turns into a curse. So everything he touches turns to gold. So, at first he's all excited, so he's touching things, it's all turning to gold, and then he'll go and sit down, and they serve him his food. So when he goes to touch the food turns to gold. And then he's getting frustrated about not eating, and eventually his daughter comes in, and he goes to touch his daughter, and his daughter turns to gold. So all I can think of here with David taking this city is just King Midas. Everything he wants, he gets. And that seems like a really good thing until you realize that curses come with that. He wants a city, he takes a city. He wants a country, he takes a country. He wants a woman, he takes a woman. And he just doesn't care what the consequences are, but there are consequences that comes with all of this. So then in chapter 13, some time passed. David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and David's son Amnon was infatuated with her. Amnon was frustrated to the point of making himself sick over his sister Tamar, because she was a virgin, but it seemed impossible to do anything to her. Yes, because it's your sister, because it's your half-sister, right? So I'm sure you all remember, you've all got it etched in the back of your memory, but just so, we'll go over David's children. Now, these are all from when he first becomes king over Israel. Since then, he's probably acquired a lot more women. But these are his official, first 6 wives. His first 6 wives. We know he's had more. We know also that Bathsheba is an official wife, and eventually she will be made queen. But these are his first 6 heirs. That's a problem when you're a king, and we're going to see that this is going to become an issue, because when you have multiple legitimate bloodlines, they're going to fight for who's the right bloodline. So the oldest seems to be Amnon. This is his wife by Ahinoam, which is always funny to me because we read the Abigail story like it's this great romance, that Abigail was always meant to be, the one. She was his one true love, blah, blah, blah. When he already had Michal, who I don't think was a bad girl. And even after he marries Abigail, we're told that he already had Ahinoam, who we're never really introduced to as a character. She just is there. She just exists, which is always funny to me. And presumably the crown prince is Amnon, even though Ahinoam is is practically not even a character in the book. But Amnon seems to be the crown prince. And Abigail, who we're supposed to think of as this one true love, she has a son, but Chileab is hardly ever mentioned. Whatever happens to him, I don't know. The main ones we know about are Amnon from this story, which is not a great story, Absalom, which is not a great story. We are going to have Adonijah, who's going to be not a very good character either. And then we'll have the others in various capacities moving forward. But for right now, we're going to be concerned with Amnon and Absalom. So Amnon is the son of Ahinoam, which you should vaguely remember. So she's been a wife since before Abigail. And then Absalom's mom, he married sometime before Hebron, but I don't think it tells us exactly when. Yeah. These are just the first 6 that we know about. And what struck me as we were thinking about this is, because we're talking about David's phases of life, right? And I can't help but make the connection between David and Jacob. And one of the things that's always interested me is that if you follow the chronology of Jacob's life, Joseph is born right before he reconciles with Esau. So his first 10 kids all grow up with their dad being the trickster. They all grow up with their dad being the villain, cheating, lying, stealing to get what he wants, and he usually gets what he wants. He gets wealthy basically as a trickster. Joseph is the one who's raised, and really it's mainly Joseph, who's raised by a father after he's broken. And so Joseph is very different. I'm sure his upbringing was very different compared to his brothers. And when we think about the main heirs, right, to David's earlier sons, most of these were born before he's crowned in Hebron. But all of these are going to be raised up, particularly, especially moving forward, like Absalom, Adonijah, and so on. They're all going to be raised by David while he's king. So they know him from that kind of third phase of his life. The main son that we're introduced to, who's raised by a broken David, is going to be Solomon, which is probably why Solomon turns out so differently. And I can't help but kind of make some connection between Joseph and Solomon in this way, and why they're so different compared to their brothers, just in terms of temperament, in terms of kind of worldview, their attitudes, that they just seem to be very different, and it's probably because they're essentially raised by radically different fathers. David, after Bathsheba, is a different man from David before Bathsheba, just like Jacob is a different man after his reconciliation with Esau than he was before. So, with that in mind, right, Amnon, Absalom, and all those guys, they're raised by a David who is pretty arrogant, pretty obnoxious, a David who feels like he can do whatever he wants, who can take whatever he wants. And that's the model that they've been raised under. That's what they think a king should be. So is it any surprise to us that that's what they end up becoming? So in verse 3, Amnon had a friend named Jonadab, a son of David's brother Shemaiah. So that would make him a cousin, right? Jonadab was a very shrewd man. And he asked Amnon, "Why are you, the king's son, so miserable every morning? Won't you tell me?" Amnon replied, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." So verse 5. Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend you're sick. When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Please let my sister Tamar come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare food in my presence so I can watch and eat from her hand.'" So Amnon lay down and pretended to be sick. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my presence so I can eat from her hand." This is not a great friend. This is not good advice. We'll keep going. So in verse 7, David said to Tamar at the palace, "Please go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare a meal for him." Then Tamar went to his house while Amnon was lying down. She took dough, kneaded it, made cakes in the presence, and baked them. She brought the pan and set it down in front of him, but he refused to eat. Amnon said, "Everyone leave me," and everyone left him. "Bring the meal to the bedroom." Amnon told Tamar, "So I can eat from your hand." Tamar took the cakes she had made and went to her brother Amnon's bedroom. When she brought them to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, "Come sleep with me, my sister." So verse 12. "Don't, my brother," she cried, "don't humiliate me, for such a thing should never be done in Israel. Don't do this horrible thing." She's not wrong. So you got the rape issue, but incest is strictly forbidden. It's clearly outlined in Leviticus 18, 20, and Deuteronomy 27. And incest includes sleeping with half-sisters. So this is strictly against Torah. So in verse 13, "Where could I ever go with my disgrace? And you would be like one of the immoral men in Israel. Please speak to the king, for he won't keep me from you." But he refused to listen to her, and because he was stronger than she was, he raped her. So this is an interesting thing when she goes, "He won't keep me from you." That's hard to believe because, again, this is strictly outlawed in Israel. She's probably saying whatever she thinks she has to say to get him to let her go, And like, well, if you ask your dad, maybe he'd approve the union, just trying to get out of the room. It's hard to imagine that David would approve this. And that's probably why Amnon knows David's never going to approve this. So this story is surprisingly similar to an earlier rape scene. And that's going to be in Genesis 34. We have the rape of Dinah. So Jacob has at least one. We know he has multiple daughters because it mentions there are multiple daughters. But the main one we know about is Dinah. And there's the son of the local landowner. And he likes Dinah, sees her in a field. He wants to marry her, but he doesn't get permission, so he ends up raping her. But then he wants to marry her, and it results in Levi and Judah going to kill her rapist. So there are some rather interesting parallels between the two stories. In verse 15, after this, Amnon hated Tamar with such intensity that the hatred he hated her with was greater than the love he had loved her with. Get out of here, he said. So this opens up a lot of problems, which is probably among the issues she had with the situation. We do have a rather infamous rape law in Deuteronomy. So in chapter 22, if a man encounters a young woman, a virgin who is not engaged, takes hold of her and rapes her, and they are discovered, the man who raped her must give the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver, and she must become his wife because he violated her. He cannot divorce her as long as he lives. Now, this has bothered a lot of people. They feel like this is not fair, or that this is somehow completely wrong. This law is surprisingly protective of the woman, despite what you may think, because this is a woman who's not engaged, she's not betrothed, so she is, for lack of a more discreet term, she's on the market, right? She's available. If she is already betrothed, then that's considered adultery because she's already betrothed, and that can result in the rapist's death. So here we have a woman, Tamar presumably is not betrothed. So this would fall under this law. And in that case, he has to pay the virgin price, and he has to marry her. The reason why is because no respectable man is going to marry her now. She's a victim of rape. And the assumption seems to be, because we see a very similar law in other ancient law codes, the assumption seems to be that she has the right to reject him. But you have to consider what that would mean. That would mean she's probably never going to get married. That means she'll probably never have a family. That means she'll probably be stuck raised by either by her father or brothers until she dies. Or she can hope that some guy will eventually want to marry her, but chances are he's not going to be someone respectable. So, she and the family can basically force the rapist to marry her. And now she's his problem. And embedded in this law, which is really interesting, is that he can't divorce her. So he is stuck providing for her for the rest of her life. And there's no way for him out of this. I think it's supposed to be a pretty significant deterrent. Because, if she is engaged, the family can demand that he's killed. And if she's not, the family can demand that he basically is financially responsible for the rest of her life. So Amnon, right, has raped her, and now she is basically stuck in this situation because no respectable man's probably going to want her. And that means that all the responsibility is now on him to provide for her. But there's going to come a lot of stigma with that. She is now a victim of rape. He is a rapist. It's going to get out. There's the incest issue. So that's going to come out, obviously. They're no longer going to be a respectable couple. That's just never going to be an option. But this is what he has to do. And again, according to the law, he doesn't have the right to opt out of this. So when she says, you got to take care of me, legally, he has no standing to say no. So in verse 16, no, she cried, sending me away is much worse than the great wrong you've already done. So she's already said, I don't want to just be sent away, because if I leave and it gets out that this has happened to me, I'll be ridiculed, I'll be called all kinds of horrible things, and I'll never get married. because I will not be allowed in respectable society. So you have to take care of me. And the law is there to protect the woman in this situation, because otherwise, what's going to happen to her? So the law, as socially questionable as you may find it, the law is actually written that way to protect the woman from a situation like this, so that she is not left without options. And we see this law in very similar other law codes. And built in, it's interesting we don't have the provision in Deuteronomy, but built in, the family can say, it's funny, in most law codes, the family can, they still, you still have to pay the virgin price because you've taken her virginity. But if the family just knows that the guy is bad news or that the guy won't take care of her, the family can take the money and tell him to scram. So it's not like the only option is sending her off with what could otherwise be a bad person. So presumably she has the right to say, no, I don't want to be with you. But again, the law seems to be written in such a way that all the rights go to the woman in this case. That if she says, you got to take care of me, the guy has no say in that. He has to take care of her. So here, in this situation with Tamar, she's like, you've done this, there's no going back, you have to take care of me. And again, under the law, according to Deuteronomy, he can't back out. All the rights go to her. But he refused to listen to her. So, I mean, this guy is bad on every possible level. Now, in a just situation, they would go to a judge who would adjudicate and would have to say, well, according to Deuteronomy, it's cut and dry. If she wants to be with you and she's willing to live with her rapist, you can't turn her away. That's the provision in Deuteronomy. So verse 17, instead he called to the servant who waited on him, throw this woman out and bolt the door behind her. Amnon's servant threw her out and bolted the door behind her. Now Tamar was wearing a long-sleeved garment because this is what the king's virgin daughters wore. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long-sleeved garment she was wearing. She put her hand on her head and went away crying out. So this is pretty much the worst thing he could possibly do to her. So in verse 20, her brother Absalom said to her, has your brother Amnon been with you? Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart. So Tamar lived as a desolate woman in the house of her brother Absalom. So she's just going to live with her brother because Amnon isn't going to take care of her. Verse 21. When King David heard about all these things, he was furious. Absalom didn't say anything to Amnon, either good or bad, because he hated Amnon since he disgraced his sister Tamar. Yeah. So then the very next thing is 2 years later. Now, this is strange to me because we are going to jump 2 years. And the issue is, what happened? Why hasn't there been any sort of involvement, especially from David's part? Again, it seems like this should have been resolved in one way or the other. Tamar should have been taken care of. Amnon should have been punished. Right? If you are the king, you are the high judge. You have to adjudicate these things. And we have a very serious crime here. One of the princesses has been raped. She demands, basically, that she's going to be taken care of, and the one who's supposed to take care of her isn't doing it. So we have 2 violations here, right? We've got the rape itself, which needs to be dealt with, and we have the fact that she needs to be provided for, and the guy who needs to isn't going to do anything. Where's David in this? Not only he's the father, so he has responsibility as the father for both parties, which that's an issue, but also as king, this kind of thing can't stand. You can't let this kind of thing happen. This is a major deal. And we just jumped 2 years. And we are going to find out that nothing's been resolved. In 2 years, nothing's happened. You can't force him. Yeah, no one's forcing him to do anything because he's the king. He's just not doing anything. Yeah, we're going to get to that. So, verse 23. 2 years later, Absalom's sheep shearers were at Baal Hazor near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. That's got to be a lot of sons. Then he went to the king and said, "Your servant has just hired sheep shearers. Will the king and his servants please come with your servant?" Verse 25, the king replied to Absalom, "No, my son, we should not all go, or we would be a burden to you." Although Absalom urged him, he wasn't willing to go, though he did bless him. It seems like this is just an odd request. Why do you need that many people to shear sheep? Presumably Absalom has enough people. And to ask for all of his brothers, all the princes of Israel, all of David's servants to come and shear sheep, it seems like an odd thing. Like, why would you need that many people? And all I'm thinking of is, Absalom. I'm thinking of like the Aladdin moment. I have servants who go for my servants. I have servants who go for my servants for my servants. Like we have people to do this stuff. Like, I don't need to do this. My sons don't need to do this. You don't need to do this. Like, what are you doing? This is obviously Absalom setting something up, right? So verse 26. If not, Absalom said, "Please let my brother Amnon go with us." Like, okay, well, if I can't get all of my brothers, how about this one brother who's going to come with me and help shear sheep? Why? Why do you need one brother, and why this specific brother? You would think that David would know something's up. This seems like a very odd situation, a very specific situation that's been orchestrated. But the king asked him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom urged him, so he sent Amnon and all the king's sons. This seems like a very odd situation. It's like David knows this is odd, and yet he's going to allow it to happen because David doesn't want to get involved. He just doesn't want to, just let it all play out, whatever. He's just up in the air, and I just don't care. This is a problem. It's a problem when you want to be king because you don't have the luxury to not get involved. Because when you don't get involved, things keep getting worse. So verse 28. Now Absalom commanded his young men, "Watch Amnon until he is in a good mood from the wine." We're going to get him liquored up. This is probably after the sheep shearing, they're celebrating or whatever, and they're going to have some sort of party, is my guess. "When I order you to strike Amnon, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Am I not the one who has commanded you? Be strong and courageous." So Absalom's young men did to Amnon just as Absalom had commanded. Then all the rest of the king's sons got up, and each fled on his mule. So the first thing that comes to mind is Absalom is taking this or orchestrating this in a very different way from David, right? Because David arranged a murder of his own, but in that case, he ordered Joab to carry it out fairly elaborately, and even after it happened, David has done everything he can not to take responsibility for it. "Oh, I didn't do it. It was, Joab, or it was, some enemy archer or whatever. It was Yahweh. Yahweh did it. It's always Yahweh's fault. He could have stopped it." Here's Absalom, and he's like, "I give the order. It's my kill. Don't worry about it. This is on me." It's a very different picture from David. Like, Absalom's willing to take credit for this. And for better or worse, we're going to see people admire Absalom. There's a reason why so many people are going to want to follow Absalom. He's a man of action, and he sticks by what he does. He's decisive. And we can contrast that with David. David is not decisive anymore. David second-guesses himself. David is passive. David's hiding in Jerusalem. And Absalom's almost the polar opposite right now. It is funny that he does all of this, and it makes you wonder how much were the other brothers in on this? Like, were they aware, or was this completely just out of the blue? Like, they're just partying or whatever, and then all of a sudden one of the servants slits Amnon's throat, the oldest son, the crown prince, and then they all just kind of bolt. None of them stop it. None of them have any questions. None of them wonder what's going on. It's rather strange. It makes me wonder if they knew what was happening. Like, they know something's up, but none of them are going to stop it. Maybe because they think it should happen. I don't know. Verse 30, while they were on the way, a report reached David. Absalom struck down all the king's sons. Not even one of them survived. In response, the king stood up, tore his clothes, and lay down on the ground, and all his servants stood by with their clothes torn. So here we have a story that has clearly gotten out of hand. Right? By the time the message has reached David, it's gone from Absalom had Amnon murdered to Absalom has wiped out all the other sons. Which, considering what goes on in the ancient world, that's not out of the realm of possibility. Right? If Absalom wants to be king that badly, you got to take out the other sons. Now, Absalom doesn't do this. Solomon will. Solomon's going to clean house. So Solomon's going to make sure that there aren't any other heirs to the throne. So this will eventually happen, just not yet. But it's funny to me that this happens, and David's response is just fall to the ground, tear his clothes, not get involved, not actually go out and see what happened, not go and confront Absalom. He just doesn't know what to do. 32. But Jonadab, son of David's brother Shemaiah, spoke up. My lord must not think they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, because only Amnon is dead. Only one is dead. Okay. In fact, Absalom has planned this ever since the day Amnon disgraced his sister Tamar. So now, my lord the king, don't take seriously the report that says all the king's sons are dead, only Amnon is dead. So not only is there a relief because only Amnon is dead, but now he gets confirmation that Absalom has been planning this for 2 years. All under David's nose. David hasn't guessed anything. He hasn't intervened. He hasn't tried to stop this. He hasn't tried to fix this. He's just let it he's just let it fester. And it's resulted in one son killing one of the others. Verse 34. Meanwhile, Absalom had fled. When the young man who was standing looked up, there were many people coming from the road west of him from the side of the mountain. Jonadab said to the king, "Look, the king's sons have come. It's exactly like your servant said." Just as he finished speaking, the king's sons entered and wept loudly. Then the king and all his servants also wept bitterly. David's crying a lot in his old age. And just the more that this happens, the more you want David to do something. You want him to get involved. Right? He's let one of his sons rape one of his daughters. He's now let one of his sons murder one of his other sons. Things are spiraling quickly. And David's just letting it happen. So in verse 37, now Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son every day. Absalom had fled and gone to Geshur, where he stayed 3 years. Then King David longed to go to Absalom, for David had finished grieving over Amnon's death. So Geshur is a territory east of the Sea of Kinnereth, up there in the north. We will get to the significance of this because it's actually near one of the cities of refuge, which might be why he's up there. This kind of reminds me a bit, this is why I wanted to go and reread the bit about the first son dying, that we now see a very similar situation, right? In the beginning, we had Bathsheba lost a son, David's all mourning and so on, and then he just gets over it, and now he's got another son to worry about. He's got Solomon. So here, David has now lost Amnon, and he grieves over Amnon, but eventually he gets over it, and now he wants to reconcile with Absalom. We'll get to the significance of that. So in verse 1, Joab, son of Zeruiah, observed that the king's mind was on Absalom. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa to bring a clever woman from there. He told her, "Pretend to be in mourning, dress in mourning clothes, and don't put on any oil. Act like a woman who has been mourning for the dead for a long time. Go to the king and speak these words to him." Then Joab told her exactly what to say. So David is unconsolable. He's mourning for his son. And it seems like he's more upset, at least to me, it seems like he's more upset about losing Absalom than he is losing Amnon. And it's cutting into his responsibilities as king. He doesn't want to do anything. He already wasn't doing anything, but now he's doing even less than nothing. And Joab is like, this isn't good. We need David to do something. We need David to at least put on the air that he's doing something. So Joab is going to put on this elaborate ruse to kind of jumpstart David into acting like king again. So in verse 4, when the woman from Tekoa came to the king, she fell with her face to the ground in homage and said, "Help me, my king." "What's the matter?" the king asked her. Verse 5, "To tell the truth, I am a widow. My husband died," she said. "Your servant had 2 sons. They were fighting in the field with no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him. Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant and said, 'Hand over the one who killed his brother, so we may put him to death for the life of the brother he murdered. We will destroy the heir. They would extinguish my one remaining ember by not preserving my husband's name or posterity on the earth. Okay, so we've got a number of issues here. First off, we have a violation of the sixth commandment, don't murder. And we know that murder, this goes back to the Absalom, because this is all right, this is going to be sort of an allegory for what Absalom did to Amnon. Murder is not just striking someone, it can include unintentionally killing someone, it can also include conspiracy to commit murder. Murder is a fairly broad category. So in Deuteronomy 19, we have, when the Lord your God annihilates the nations whose land he is giving you, so that you drive them out and live in their cities and houses, you are to set apart 3 cities for yourselves within the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess. You are to determine the distances and divide the land the Lord your God is granting you as an inheritance into 3 regions, so that anyone who commits manslaughter can flee to these cities. So if you murder someone, right, or if you kill someone, you can flee to one of these cities of refuge. And there you can demand a trial to see whether or not you deserve the punishment, whether it's being put to death or something else. The prohibition against murder, I shouldn't even have to say this, is completely universal. Every law code has this. Don't kill. Killing is bad. So in Numbers 35, we're actually told, the cities you give the Levites will include 6 cities of refuge, which you must provide so that the one who kills someone may flee there. In addition to these, give 42 other cities. So the Levites get 48 in total, but there are 6 set aside specifically as cities of refuge. This is important for Absalom. So in verse 4, here is the law concerning cases when one kills a person and flees there to save his life, having killed his neighbor accidentally without previously hating him. If he goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut timber, and his hand swings the axe to chop down a tree, but the blade flies off the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies, the person may flee to one of the cities and live. Otherwise, the avenger of blood in the heat of his anger might pursue the one who committed manslaughter, overtake him because the distance is great, and strike him dead. Yet he did not deserve to die, since he did not previously hate his neighbor. So we have here the avenger of blood. Who's the avenger of blood? Well, we're not explicitly told, but presumably it's the nearest male relative. So it can be a brother, it can be an uncle, it can be a father. If there is no avenger of blood, if there's no male relative who can take on the task, then the family can appoint someone outside the family, if there's no male capable or eligible to do this. So this is what happens if you murder someone. So just to put it in slightly broader context, there's a great story. It's really fun, because this is usually attributed to the beginning of murder trials. And that is the tragedy of the house Atreus. So the house Atreus is the house of Agamemnon. Agamemnon is the one who starts the Trojan War. So what happens? Well, Agamemnon wants to go and sail his fleet against Troy. But he can't get his fleet out because of the storms. So he goes to a priest and he asks the priest, what do I have to do to stop the storms? And the priest says, you have to sacrifice that which is most precious to you. If this sounds similar to the story of Abraham, very good, you get a cookie. It's very similar. So he sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia, and then the storm resides. So he sails his fleet. And then we get, Hector and Achilles fighting, we get the Trojan horse, we get all of this stuff. And this will culminate in him acquiring Cassandra, who's the youngest daughter of Prius. And Cassandra says, she gives the prophecy that when you go home, you're going to be killed for sacrificing your daughter. So he goes home, and he is then murdered, assassinated, by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover. Supposedly, she murders him for sacrificing their daughter. This results in the Orestia saga. So Orestes is the son of Agamemnon. He is now stuck between not avenging his father, because he is the nearest blood relative, right? So that makes him culturally the kinsman redeemer, or not avenging him versus honoring his mother. Ultimately, he kills his mother and her lover. It's a Greek story. So he is now cursed by the gods for killing his mother, even though he did it to honor his father. In the end, he goes to the city of Athens. Of course he does. And he beseeches the goddess Athena. and says, you have to decide what to do to me. So Athena appoints a jury of 12 people to hear the case. And they will decide whether or not he should be held accountable for murdering his mother. And what do you think happens? We get a hung jury, because of course we do. So it's split 6-6. 6 say he committed murder, he should be put to death, and the other 6 say he was justified, it wasn't murder. So then we get the goddess Athena herself, who descends from the heavens, and she finally adjudicates and says that he was justified in murdering his mother. So murder is now legal in Greece. Now, what's funny about this is that this is usually treated as the first case of law by jury. But we see examples of this prior to this story. In particular, we do have the designations of cities where you can go in Israel in order to demand a jury trial if you have been accused of murder. Now, if you'll notice, one of the cities is just outside of Golan, which, if you're paying attention to the previous map, is right near the territory of Gesher. So even though we're not told, it's very likely that Absalom is holed up there. And he's been hiding out there for 3 years because this is one of the cities of refuge. So he can go there even though he's been accused of murder and not be killed in retaliation. His brothers can't kill him because if you're playing tag or whatever, you're safe, right? He's in one of the safe cities. No, there's no murder in the cities of refuge. So in verse 10, this is back in still Deuteronomy, in this way innocent blood will not be shed, and you will not become guilty of bloodshed in the land the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. But if someone hates his neighbor, lies in ambush for him, and attacks him, and strikes him fatally, and flees to one of these cities, the elders of the city must send for him, take him from there, and hand him over to the avenger of blood, and he will die. You must not look on him with pity, but purge from Israel the guilt of shedding innocent blood, and you will prosper. So, if you have been accused of committing murder, you can flee to one of the cities of refuge and demand a trial. And then the elders there will hear the case. And then they will determine whether or not you're innocent or guilty. Presumably, there will be some sort of trial where they will bring the avenger in, who will give evidence, testimony, whatever they've got. But if the jury says, you killed the guy, you should be punished, then they have to turn him over to the avenger, where he will then be executed. Now, this is all important because Absalom has been hiding, presumably in a city of refuge, for over 2 years. Now it's closer to 3 years. Where's the avenger of blood? Where's the trial? Why hasn't anything happened? Presumably because no one wants to have a trial against one of the princes. And David, who probably has the authority to put pressure on the city or to decide, to make a decision himself, he doesn't want to get involved. This is frustrating. So we're back in 2 Samuel, verse 8. The king told the woman, "Go home, I will issue a command on your behalf." Then the woman of Tekoa said to the king, "My lord the king, may any blame be on me and my father's house, and may the king and his throne be innocent. Whoever speaks to you," the king said, "bring him to me. He will not trouble you again." So then verse 11, she replied, "Please may the king invoke the Lord your God so that the avenger of blood may not increase the loss, and they will not eliminate my son. As the Lord lives," he vowed, "not a hair of your son will fall to the ground." Then the woman said, "Please may your servant speak a word to my lord the king." "Speak," he replied. So the woman is here now again, we have a very clear-cut process, right? If the son has been accused of murder, even his own brother, he goes to one of the cities of refuge, and then there's a trial by the elders. And then they determine whether or not he's guilty. Instead, she is completely circumventing the entire process to go to David and say, I've already lost one son. Killing the other isn't going to bring him back. Well, it's not about whether or not killing him is going to bring him back. The fact is, we've got a murder. And the first son, or the murdered son, needs to be dealt with. But David is just completely bypassing the whole process and says, we might as well not have 2 dead boys on our hands. We might as well just completely negate the process altogether. So verse 13, the woman asked, "Why have you devised something similar against the people of God when the king spoke as he did about this matter? He has pronounced his own guilt. The king has not brought back his own banished one. We will certainly die and be like water poured out on the ground, which can't be recovered. But God would not take away a life. He would devise plans so that the banished one from him does not remain banished. This is really, you should get a little chill down your spine when you read this verse. So the woman is basically saying, if you're willing to do this for me, just completely negate this whole process that we have outlined in Torah for my son, well, why wouldn't you do it for your own son? And surely God wouldn't want another death. I mean, hasn't there been enough bloodshed? What is killing the other son really going to do? Is it going to bring back the first son? It's not about whether or not it brings back the son. It's about what is just. It's about what is right. There's been a murder, and the law declares that there needs to be a trial, and there needs to be punishment. We already saw this with the Bathsheba incident, right? David murdered someone, and murder demands a life. End up losing a kid over that, right? Because God's judgment is absolute. And here's David like, yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, what's killing your son gonna do? And he's like, well, you're right. How's bringing Absalom to justice really gonna make anything better? How is it really gonna solve the problem or make the problem go away? So, verse 15. Now therefore I've come to present this matter to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I must speak to the king. Perhaps the king will grant his servant's request. The king will surely listen in order to rescue his servant from the hand of this man who would eliminate both me and my son from God's inheritance. Your servant thought, may the word of my lord the king bring relief, for my lord the king is able to discern the good and the bad like the angel of God. May the Lord your God be with you. Just absolutely incredible. I came to you because I knew that you know right from wrong, and your justice is just as though the angel of God himself came down and decided it. I'm not sure David's in the frame of mind to render justice according to the angel of God, but she is very much speaking flattery to David. Then in verse 18, then the king answered the woman, I'm going to ask you something, don't conceal it from me. Let my lord the king speak, the woman replied. The king asked, did Joab put you up to this? It's like David has just figured it out. It's like, how long did he know this? So he knows this whole thing is just made up. The whole thing is just a big ruse to make him feel better about not doing anything to Absalom. So verse 19, the woman answered, as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or the left from all my lord the king says. Yes, your servant Joab is the one who gave orders to me. He told your servant exactly what to say. Joab, your servant, has done this to address the issue indirectly. But my Lord has wisdom like the wisdom of the angel of God, knowing everything on earth. I am not sure that any of these words apply to David in this moment. But David is eating it up. So verse 21, then the king said to Joab, I hereby grant this request, go bring back the young man Absalom. And like that, murder is now legal in Israel. Because why do we need jury trials? Why do we need evidence? Why do we need justice when the king can just say, what's it going to do? How is bringing justice to Absalom going to fix anything? How is it going to bring back Amnon? How is it going to fix the Tamar issue? So, we'll just pretend like it's all fine and just sweep it under the rug. So, there's plenty of verses we could go to. But in Proverbs 24:23, these sayings also belong to the wise. It is not good to show partiality in judgment. Here we have David clearly showing partiality to his son, not wanting to bring him to justice, not wanting to, we already know, right, that God has spared David, sure, but that did not spare him from the judgment, period. He murdered someone, and that required a life, because that's the law. So God did not spare David any pain. He didn't spare him any judgment. He just deferred it from David himself. But here's David like, it's fine. I don't need to do anything. 29:4, by justice a king brings stability to a land, but a man who demands contributions demolishes it. So the king is ultimately responsible for justice. But if you're not bringing justice, you're going to undermine everything. We see this very clearly in Ecclesiastes 4:13. Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer pays attention to warnings. And I think that this is going to summarize David moving forward very clearly. He is just completely oblivious to how all these little things are just stacking one after the other. The ignoring Absalom, the not dealing with the issues in his own family, letting his kids infight. It's just building. It's going to keep building, festering. One of my favorite verses in Ecclesiastes is 8:11. Because the sentence against a criminal act is not carried out quickly, the heart of people is filled with the desire to commit crime. And it's not just that it's not carried out, it's that it's not carried out quickly. Because if people don't see justice in action, they will lose faith in the system. I mean, this is kind of one of the jokes in our culture, right? That we have this endless appeal process. And by the time we even get around to final judgment, it's been 10, 20, 30 years. Like, why are we even doing this anymore? Like, why do we care anymore? Someone died, or maybe multiple people died, or someone got affected in some horrible way. But we've dragged this out for so long that we've pretty much forgotten as a culture why it was even relevant. And we completely lose faith in the system. So when you have a king, right, who's not enacting his own justice, the people are not going to be happy. The people are going to see that the king is partial. They're going to see that the king isn't doing his job, and they're going to demand change. And this is just, the revolution is coming, and David is not heeding the warnings. So verse 22, we're almost done. Joab fell with his face to the ground in homage and praised the king. Today, Joab said, your servant knows I have found favor with you, my lord the king, because the king has granted the request of your servant. So Joab got up, went to Geshur, and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. However, the king added, he may return to this house, but he may not see my face. So Absalom returned to his house, but he did not see the king. And this, to me, just echoes very loudly one of the first big errors we find with Saul. And that was over the honey issue, right? Because Saul said no one's allowed to eat anything. But then Jonathan goes and he eats the honey. And then he gets the victory. And then the people know that something's happened. It's been brought to Saul's attention that someone violated his promise. And he said, if anyone violates the promise, that person has to die. So he finds out that it's Jonathan. And now he's stuck between keeping his commandment, right, keeping his promise to execute whoever violated the oath, or just straight up sparing Jonathan. But that would mean that he has reneged. But either way, Saul has to do something. Either he has to bring judgment on Jonathan, or he has to pardon Jonathan and risk his own judgment coming on him. And what does Saul end up doing? Nothing. So what happens from that? His own army turn on him. And this is a very big warning for David, right? The people expect you to be decisive. They expect you to act. And if you don't, if you show partiality, if you show hesitation, if you show cowardice, whatever, the people will turn on you. They turned on Saul, and it's coming. So, on that wonderful note, we'll end there for tonight.
I'm so glad we don't have such things today. John, would you close us in prayer?